Hello! In the previous video in this series, it was reviewed whether there was any truth in the belief that genes are somehow superdeterministic in comparison with environmental causes, and it was established that this is just a myth of extraordinary tenacity. The next accusation is the accusation of reductionism. The previous video finished thus. There are two issues at stake here. Firstly, can we successfully reduce all evolutionary explanation to the level of the gene? And relatedly, does this mean that selection only operates at the level of the gene? The answers are in this chapter: reduction and levels of selection. The disagreement between evolutionary biologists usually focuses on the second of these questions. Many feel that Dawkins is asking selection to act exclusively on genes, while almost everyone agrees that much selection happens at the gene level. Some argue that selective forces act on organisms and possibly on groups as well. Some deny that genes can possibly have the causal power that Dawkins demands of them. In more technical language, a quotation: the claim is that in some populations, properties of individual alleles are not positive causal factors in the survival and reproductive success of the relevant organisms. Kim Sterelny and Philip Kitcher. Close the quotation. The sort of example these critics point to is the problem of a gene whose effect is dependent on the frequency of other genes, in brackets, or itself. Consider our tit-for-tat strategy earlier. Behaving in a tit-for-tat fashion is more profitable if everyone else is following the same strategy, or some similar strategy that will lead to mutual cooperation. If you are heavily outnumbered by cheats, however, it loses much of its appeal. If tit-for-tat behavior sometimes increases survival and sometimes doesn't, then how can we say that there is a causal relation between that behavior and survival? And if the behavior doesn't cause survival, then how can a gene for that behavior do so? We have already uncovered the answer. Genes cannot act in isolation. Their effects are always contingent upon the environment, and that environment includes other genes. Just as a piece of protein encoding DNA won't produce an eye unless it has the correct environment. In brackets, for example, the environment of a developing embryo with a complete genome, close the brackets. So some genes will not produce benefits unless a reasonable number of other individuals share that gene. A footnote. What is a reasonable number? This will depend on the benefits conferred by the gene, the frequency of other genes, and the effect that frequency has on the benefits, and so on. Close the footnote. The fact that in the first case the inverted commas environmental genes are in the same individual, while in the second they are in a different individual, is irrelevant. Both are part of the gene's environment. Another strategy, exemplified by Dawkins' most famous critic, Stephen Jay Gould, is to argue that even if genes have causal effects on phenotypes, natural selection cannot act directly on genes, as they are tied up in bodies. Thus, phenotypes are selected, not genes. A quotation. According to Gould, Dawkins is unable to give genes, in inverted commas, direct visibility to natural selection, close the inverted commas. Bodies must play intermediary roles in the process of selection, and since the properties of genes do not map on one-one fashion onto the properties of bodies, we cannot attribute selective advantages to individual alleles. A footnote. Sterelny and Kitcher in The Return of the Gene. Close the quotation. The properties of a gene in this sense means the thing that the gene is for, or determines. In brackets, for example, blue-eyedness. Close the bracket. We know that to say that a gene determines X means that it determines X in the correct environment. And we have seen that this environment includes other genes. More formally, we should say that a gene A determines X relative to another gene B in a certain environment, only if organisms which possess A and B show the characteristic X in that environment. A gene that stops eye production determines eye color, in brackets, in the sense of not having one, close the bracket, relative to another gene for eye pigment, regardless of what the eye pigment gene is. Just because we say that a gene determines one characteristic doesn't mean that it can't determine another. Our gene for no eye pigment is also a gene for no eye. Furthermore, the two in inverted commas properties of the gene need not have the same influence on the organism's chances of survival. A gene for a particularly good immune system may make its carrier more susceptible to certain autoimmune diseases. If this gene is widespread in the population, however, we can be pretty sure that it has been selected because its benefits outweigh its costs in evolutionary terms. On a slight diversion, you may by now be feeling that the organism has been almost stripped of identity. An organism's environment includes the physical world and other individuals in it. The gene's environment includes the immediate physical environment, in brackets, for example, the organism's tissues, and other genes in that body, but it extends beyond the organism to the, in inverted commas, outside world, and even includes the genes of other organisms. The barrier of the individual is invisible to genes. Likewise, the effects of genes are not confined to the individuals that possess them. We can validly talk about genes for building beaver dams, because such genes, in brackets, in the correct environment, etc., close the brackets, influence the behavior that results in the animal, in brackets, a beaver, building a dam. Dawkins has coined the phrase, in inverted commas, the extended phenotype to describe this, because the gene's effects, in brackets, its phenotype, close the bracket, in inverted commas, extend beyond the organism. Returning to the main thread, we can see that just because genes affect the environment, brackets, be it external or internal to the organism, close the bracket, in complicated and indirect ways, we do not have to abandon the claim that there is a causal link between those genes and their effects, and thus a causal link between those genes and any selective advantage conferred by those effects. Organisms are vehicles, genes are replicators. It can be argued, nevertheless, that there are times when it makes sense to talk about a trait in terms of the organism. Consider our beaver gene for dam building. Strictly speaking, this is a gene for beaver behavior that leads to dam building. The behavior is certainly a trait of the beaver. Is it not valid to describe it in these terms, and thus view selection at this level? We are no longer asking which is the, in inverted commas, correct level at which to view selection. We are asking whether there is a correct level at all. Causal stories can be described from several points of view. Dawkins' opinions on the subject shift somewhat between the selfish gene 1976 and the extended phenotype 1982. Dawkins initially implies, intentionally or not, that there is only one correct description of the causal process and that this description always puts genes center stage. The extended phenotype seems to relax this view and argue instead that there are often alternative ways of looking at selection, but that the gene-centered view will always be as good, in brackets, or better than any others available. The argument for genic selection then becomes a pragmatic one. It is the only way of looking at the matter that is guaranteed to yield a correct causal story, in brackets, although other ways, for example from the organism's point of view, may sometimes be as correct, close the brackets. In one sense, which level or levels of selection are valid in any given circumstance depends on the empirical circumstances. As Elliot Sober points out, a quotation, "There is no a priori reason to prefer lower-level selection hypotheses over higher ones. This preference is not a direct consequence of, in inverted commas, logic or the scientific method." Close the quotation. Selection will act on any entity that exists long enough for its frequency in the population to be changed, i.e. a replicator. In practice, it is difficult to see how something as unique and temporary as an individual, let alone a group, could qualify as a replicator. However, it is perfectly possible that genic selection will give rise to phenomena that appear to be a consequence of individual selection or group selection, and in some circumstances it may be pragmatic to analyze selection as if it were acting at these levels. An imperfect analogy is the workings of a car. You can choose, if you want, to explain a car's engine in terms of physical forces, particles, and their interactions. Such a fine-grained approach may be, in inverted commas, complete in some causal sense, but you will probably find it next to useless. Alternatively, you can describe the car in engineering terms, naming the components of the engine and how they interact. Or you could apply a functional description, stating how those parts are controlled to produce a desired effect. There are many, in inverted commas, levels of explanation. Similarly, when the car crashes, you could argue that the, in inverted commas, true cause of the crash was the set of velocities, forces and so forth that described the system just prior to the accident. Or you could say that the driver failed to brake in time, or that the road was wet. All of these conditions and descriptions are, in inverted commas, true causes of the crash, yet some will matter more to physicists, others to tire engineers, and others to lawyers. So we can perhaps sympathize with Dawkins' denial of group and individual selection as providing, in inverted commas, true causal stories, much as a physicist may deny that a failure to brake is the correct causal story. We can also see Gould's point, noting that it is useful in some circumstances to take a coarser-grained approach. But if we ask, in inverted commas, what does selection affect? We are asking which entities change over evolutionary time because of selection, and these can only be genes. A quotation. For natural selection to adjust the frequency of something over the generations, the entity must have a sufficient degree of permanence. You cannot adjust the frequency of an entity between times t1 and t2 if, between the two times, the entity has ceased to exist. Natural selection cannot work on whole lions because lions die. They are not permanent. Nor can it work on genomes. The lion's offspring inherit only genetic fragments, not a copy of a whole genome from their parents. Matt Ridley. Close the quotation. Thank you for listening. Bye.